One of the things that I'm very concerned about, and it's one of the things that I've dedicated huge portions of my channel's backlog to, is the increase in homicide that we saw post the George Floyd riots, and how it seems to be largely ignored by a lot of our major institutions due to the fact that they can utilize various crime denial techniques in order to obfuscate the issue that homicide is elevated quite significantly, and this is something that we should be concerned about because, again, these are actual people's human lives that are being lost, and this is largely due to terrible policy. Now, I've talked about how we actually have examples that prove positive that this is more related to the defunding of the police, that kind of sentiment, or that kind of action for the places that actually did cut their police funding, than vagaries about economic distress or things related to the pandemic. For instance, I actually found that the city of New Orleans had been freezing their police budget, ultimately cutting it in 2019, again before George Floyd, and they have seen disastrous impacts on their city. Now, some of you told me New Orleans was already bad, but in that particular time, they went from a top 5, top 7 worst city in terms of violent crime, in terms of homicide, to number 1 because they were just short the officers that every single study told them they needed to have in order to do the basics and manage public safety in the city. You can watch my full video on New Orleans, the city that defunded the police before it was cool, linked in the description, but today I want to focus on LA because I had previously touched on their recruiting problems, and I haven't really examined their numbers in the same way that I've done New York, and considering I live in New York, that's due to personal bias, so let's talk about Los Angeles. But before we get into that, I just want to say thank you to everybody who signed up over my website, actualjusticewarrior.com/join.
Give me the money. Give me the money. Okay?
And thank you to my podcast listeners on Spotify, Apple, and Google's podcasting platform. So Los Angeles, like many parts of this country in the year of 2020, post the death of George Floyd, let their citizens run amok, let the rioting go on essentially unchallenged, which honestly I find specifically offensive for the city of Los Angeles because they should have known better considering the absolute devastation that the Rodney King riots actually led to, not just in damage to buildings, but in terms of long-term economic consequences. Now, I've talked about this time and time again, that economists looked at the recovery time for the Rodney King riots over the course of 10 years, and they found out that the neighborhoods that did have the rioting, that did have the destruction, took almost a decade to get back to the point that they were back in the 90s, from the rioting, from the fact that people didn't want to invest in that area. So it was a long-term economic devastation, and when compared to a hurricane that did the same amount of damage in Miami at the same time, the same year, they recovered within a year. So rioting is quite literally worse than natural disasters. Now, when we do a 30-year retrospective on the Rodney King riots, what we find out is that those areas still lag behind. So if you were a politician in Los Angeles and you thought it was cool to not call the National Guard, you thought it was acceptable to allow the chaos to go unchallenged in your city, you essentially knew exactly what happened, saw the neighborhoods where it happened, knew the consequences of those actions, and allowed people to destroy themselves, and not just themselves, but future generations, all because you were too cowardly to stand up to a political movement that had gotten completely out of hand. I know a lot of people were stressed about the George Floyd situation. That video, that cell phone video in particular, is gut-wrenching. It looked terrible, but that is no excuse for the destruction that we've seen across our major cities, across this country, and the negative effects, and passing a bunch of pieces of legislation that ultimately led into the crime wave, or the giant crime spike, whatever you want to call it, that we saw nationwide, and in specific in major metropolitan areas. And Los Angeles was no exception. I want you to look at this chart. This is a chart of homicides in Los Angeles as tracked by the LAPD, and as you can see, the results were not good. So in 2012, which is the pre-George Floyd worst year, you saw 299 homicides in Los Angeles. Then you see it drop significantly to 251, 260, it goes up and touches 294 again, but you could see it's on a precipitous decline going into 2019. And there's no reason why we should not have expected that trend to continue. Now, some people put forward the hypothetical that it was the pandemic, the lockdown, people scared about COVID, anxiety, economic anxiety, and all those things that led to the spike in the year of 2020. It had nothing to do with the George Floyd riots. It's not like there's a month-to-month chart that can show for a fact that it did kick off during the George Floyd riots. Oh wait, there is. Let me show you the month-to-month. Now, as you can see, there is a normal continuous trend, even during the lockdowns, even during the pandemic, that is clearly representative until about the middle of 2020. Then all of a sudden, you see the spike like you would never expect. And that spike in particular correlates with almost the 6-month mark, and considering George Floyd was killed at the end of May 2020, this is obviously an inflection point that we need to focus on. This is a point where we saw the police budget being cut, overall anti-cop sentiment, the Black Lives Matter riots, police officers in record numbers, not just in Los Angeles, but across the country, all deciding to retire early, leave the force, and unfortunately, it was not just your entry-level officers or anything like that. Some of these were the most seasoned veterans in the LAPD, so we saw a brain drain, a skill drain that is not easily replaced by new recruits. At the same time, you see the canceling of recruiting classes. So as you're losing your most crucial officers, the people who make a department run, simultaneously, you're not even replacing them with entry-level officers, and this led to an absolute crisis. Now, I've previously talked about how recruiting dropped by 600, or the net officer decrease was 600, which is 6% of the LAPD's force. It turns out those numbers were slightly outdated because now it's closer to 800, which again is 8% of the LAPD. And we go back to the year-over-year chart, and as you can see, homicides remain elevated to the highest point over the last decade in Los Angeles. Now, I just want to point out, when we're looking back at the annual homicide chart, that if you look at the number 397 for the year 2021 and then 382 as the preliminary number, by the way, for 2022, then Emma Vigeland would say, wow, homicide is down in Los Angeles. Why are you even talking about crime? So what if it's at the highest point over the last decade? It's down from year over year. Let's ignore everything else that came before it, or the fact that any of these 3 years are significantly elevated from the peak on this chart, which is 2012. Now, another crime denial tactic that somebody might put forward is the overall chart that includes the 1990s, but as I've said to anybody who brings up this asinine argument, my standard is absolutely not the worst period of time in American history. That is not what we should go to. That is not what we should refer to. I hope we never go back there. My issue is this troubling trend, which is an increase in homicide and a new baseline that we're judging everything against. And I just want to point out that on net, we're up in the city of Los Angeles about 45 to 50% from what was the 2019 numbers and what was the trend that previously existed. And that is not something to sing about when you drop about 3% from the absolute peak in 2021. I'm sorry, but a small, petty, negligible, statistically irrelevant could be erased when the LAPD puts out its full statistics related to the year 22 decrease is nothing to sing about when you have a nearly 50% increase. I mean, think about it like this. What if we were talking about CEOs and there was a CEO bonus thing, and one year they ended up getting 50% more in their bonus, and they were out in the paper the year after that because they saw a 3% decrease? All of these progressives would be pointing out the overall trend in their pay. They'd be pointing out that this argument makes no sense, but by Emma Vigeland's logic, that is a significant cut in pay, and honestly, we should just pay attention to only the cut in pay in that scenario. Now, obviously, she would never say that. Obviously, she would never bring that up. Obviously, then all of a sudden, the relative to the past decade statistics would matter overall. But this is something that we really need to harp on. We really need to talk about, especially since a lot of the people that are being killed are supposedly the same people that these left-wing progressives want to protect. I saw a number, and I forget which year it was. I believe it was in 2021. I'll put the source and the real number on screen so you nerds can correct me, even though I will correct myself if I'm wrong, that said that 23% of the people being killed are homeless people. We also know by the numbers that disproportionately, not just the number of people being killed, but the number of people being killed in the increase are black males in particular, and young black males under the age of 18 also account for a significant portion of the increase. Remember, defund the police was supposed to protect those very same people from the oppressive police force, but guess what? That's not what it did. Now, we're also going to talk about the fact that even though they cut the budget of the police for one specific year, they then elevated that budget. And Karen Bass, the new mayor in town, has actually pledged to spend more money on the police. But I need to address this because it's important you understand the context of that. Because when you change your attitude, when you start cutting the budget of the police department, when you push down all of these reforms to, again, deal with an issue that happened in Minneapolis, not in Los Angeles, that ended up leading to a bunch of officers resigning. As we talked about 8% of the force. That creates a problem because you can't just restore that by restoring the budget to where it previously was. On top of that, in order to compensate for the shortage of new recruits, one of the things that the Los Angeles Police Department has had to do is work more of their officers overtime. So the officers that are there are, again, not disproportionately in those high-end crucial units like homicide, like trafficking, sexual assault, they're top investigators, but they're also being taxed even more in that they're working hard, so they're more tired. So what you're seeing is even the officers that were there pre-recruiting shortage are going to be performing worse due to the fact that they're just working more. We all understand this, that you lose productivity as you don't sleep, as you spend more time on the job, and this is going to lead to more negative consequences for the police department and the communities that they interact with. Now, to be clear, they have tried almost everything to boost recruitment. First of all, the LAPD pays $110,000 according to Glassdoor, and if you rank up a bit, you can make more than that. You have great pension, great benefits, and Karen Bass even introduced some kind of policy that essentially would try to find these people housing so they could live as they work in Los Angeles, because even at $100,000, you can't really afford a property in Los Angeles due to their various insane housing regulations, not just on the city level, but at the state level. But the thing is, everywhere's experiencing an officer shortage. The fact is, if you're somebody aspiring for a career in the government, if you want those benefits and all those luxuries, you probably want to be a teacher instead, because if you're doing your job appropriately, the chances of you being prosecuted for that, not gonna happen if you're a teacher. You probably want to work at sanitation instead for the same reason. Because just like with the police funding, the laws that were put on the books, which by the way have not all been pared back and have not all been repealed, are also producing an effect. The George Floyd effect is actually more dangerous and more pernicious than the George Floyd regulation, because you know, as an officer, specifically if you're an officer of the wrong skin tone, that any interaction can be blown up. And I'm not saying that there aren't deserved prosecutions of the police. Obviously, we've covered them on this channel before, into a national news story, and even if you're ultimately cleared, even if you're ultimately found not guilty, your life could be ruined, your family can be targeted, and it could be the impetus for cracking down on other officers. And even if you're an officer acting accordingly the way you should be right now, it's only a matter of time before an incident triggers another series of policies that just make it more and more difficult for you to do your job. The reason why people work for the government is great benefits, but more importantly, stability. And there's a lot of instability in policing, and that, as it remains, is going to drive down recruiting for years into the future. And lowering the standards, like we talked about Karen Bass doing on the DL, is only going to bring worse quality officers, which is going to have lower quality interactions, which is going to increase the chance that we have more police stories, which is going to essentially create a death spiral, and that is going to create a ton of problems. And again, the crime increase is real. The problems in Los Angeles are legitimate. You can go back to the 90s, the worst point throughout history, and say, wow, it's not as bad as the 90s, but we shouldn't take note of the fact whenever we see a dramatic increase. And again, it's not in Los Angeles only, it's not even in blue areas only, it's also in red areas, a 30% increase in homicide nationwide, but it is very notable that there are some leaders ahead of that trend, and they also seem to be some of the most committed to cutting the budget of their police, to getting rid of recruiting classes to hiring or electing one of these left-wing district attorneys that doesn't want to prosecute anything, and all of that ends up compounding on itself to produce a lot of problems. Now, I did talk about before that Karen Bass seems to be making moves against homeless encampments. I'm a believer that environment impacts attitude, and when you have all these areas that look like nobody cares about it, that draws in criminal behavior. So getting rid of that, I would hope, would actually lead to reductions in crime, but she has to be committed to do that, and not just when she comes into office recently and she's at the height of her political capital, but throughout the course of her term. She needs to be committed to making a substantial difference in the appearance of LA, because hopefully that will lead to improvements in the behavior. Again, people think broken windows is this crazy right-wing policy that just means prosecute every crime no matter how small, but in reality, if you were to describe it as it was originally described, it would be considered a progressive intervention, because it's based on the idea that environment impacts behavior, that if something looks abandoned, like nobody's going to care about it, then people will act in accordance with how it appears. And that's why it's important to make those visual, so-called superficial improvements, because that has an impact on the character of the people. But hey, those are just my thoughts. Let me know your thoughts down in the comments below. If you liked the video, show them by leaving a like, subscribe for more content, follow me on all my social media, support me via the support links in the description of this video. This has been me talking about the problems in Los Angeles. Till next time.